welcome to everyone who's here. It was hard to know exactly what this would be like in some ways without knowing who was coming. And here we are. And I hope this will be a valuable conversation. I didn't overly prepare a lot of material. I really wanted to rely on our sharing with each other. But here's where this idea came from. And let me introduce myself first. I'm sorry. My name's Jim Mitulski, and I'm the pastor of the Congregational Church in Belmont, California. And I was ordained in 1983. So I've been a pastor for 41 years. And where this came from as a breakout session was I have found myself saying to myself and to others sometimes lately, I'm still pastoring. And that isn't just about length of time. I have been doing it a long time, but it's also an observation about it's the thing that I love to do most, and it's why I got into ministry. And sometimes I didn't know in my first church in 1983 in New York City that I would be pastoring still in 2024. But I returned to it even when I've done other things because I love it. And I wanted to create an opportunity for us to talk about what it is that we love about pastoring and what it is that we need in order to continue doing it. Now, I want to acknowledge too that, as I said, I've had a broad experience. I've pastored either as a settled minister or an interim minister in 10 different congregations in Massachusetts, Texas, Colorado, Minnesota, California, and in 3 different denominations: the Metropolitan Community Churches, the UCC, and the Disciples. And I also pastored in Berkeley, I should say, in San Francisco. But in all of that, I've seen small churches, large churches, urban, suburban, rural. It's continued to draw me back to this work. And even though I had periods of time where I was a denominational executive or where I worked at a seminary, like Pacific School of Religion, which I've done off and on several times over the years, I still keep coming back to pastoring a church is the thing that I derive the most satisfaction from, but also the thing that I really feel called to most. And I've learned a few things about it, but really I want to hear what others are thinking about it. Because we know that pastoring a church today is even different from what it was pre-COVID, and that's still relatively recent. The truth is that people aren't coming to church as much as they were even 5 years ago. And what that means for us vocationally, professionally, but also what it means for us from day to day. Probably the kind of church we prepared to pastor when we were in seminary is not the norm anymore. People don't just come to church. So we have to kind of work at it and reinvent it to make it a more credible and engaging place. And yet, some of us keep still doing it. And we do it knowing that it's not always seen even as the thing that's the thing you're supposed to do for your whole career. Often people will say, at least to me, well, why would you go from being a denominational executive to going back to pastoring, or as if that were a backward step? And for me, it's evolution. I really love community or spiritual community organizing, which is what I think of being a pastor. It's other things too. And I'm in touch with the thing I love most, or that only happens in churches, or principally, is I like worship, I like preaching, and I like pastoral care. Those are the 3 things that really keep me engaged. And even when I think this is my last job, here I am at 60 something, still doing it with no immediate plans to retire. So I want to ask you, tell me what you've been doing, or what engages you about pastoral ministry. Tell us where you're working, what your context is, and anything you want to say about what you love about it. And we'll start with that question and have a second question about what do you need to keep doing it.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I'm kind of, you may get kicked out of the group here. I'm not pastoring, but I'm a hospice chaplain,
Mhm.
in which I consider very close to what I did as a pastor. Let me just quickly say, I came to PSR as a minority. I was a product of North Carolina Baptist Campus Ministry, Southern Baptist, which was a very progressive bunch of guys. And when I got ready to go to seminary, I asked my mentor, should I go to Southeastern or Southern? Those were the two seminaries in the South. And he said, well, maybe you should get out of the South and away from Southern Baptist. And I said, well, where would I go? And he said, well, I was at a party one time in Berkeley, California, and I met a guy who was getting a PhD in narrative theology from Pacific School Religion. Maybe you should go there. I went back to East Carolina University where I was at, found the catalog, read every page of it, description of all the faculty. I'd always been kind of liberal in all of my, even from middle school, I was the one that challenged everything. And so I applied to PSR. I was the only Southern Baptist in 9 schools in the GTU. PSR had a little diversity scholarship, and I got a little bit of money to increase the diversity as a white male, but a Southerner. And ironically, I ran into a lot of bigotry about being from the South. For one thing, everybody assumed I was probably homophobic. I had a friend that took my wife and I to the MCC church, and we had communion, and we weren't freaked out. And he finally gave me that I was okay after my examination. So, but I love PSR. I came and studied Robert McAfee Brown, Archie Smith, Doug Adams, incredible faculty, incredibly diverse. Doug Adams, who taught me to dance when I didn't know I could dance, and a lot of the I was known as a pastor for my humor in the pulpit, and Doug Adams, and I was incredibly influenced by Robert McAfee Brown, and that would shape my ministry. And Archie Smith, who was did social interaction, and it was incredible. So anyway, I spent 2 years. I was come out there to 1 year and get a CTS. I loved it so much I stayed 2 years. And then reluctantly, I had to go back and get my MDiv from my Southern Baptist school to get back in this Baptist Campus Ministry. Baptist Campus Ministry was dismantled while I was at PSR. The dismantling, the fundamentalists took over, first attacked campus ministry. So anyway, the bottom line was the campus ministry, which I went back and got my creds for, disappeared. I tried to get a job in campus ministry in DC, ended up very fortunate working with young adults and community ministers at the First Baptist Church of Washington, DC, where President Carter had just been there and taught Sunday school. And then I went to Oakhurst Baptist Church in Decatur, Georgia, and it was an oxymoron. We were the liberal Baptists. It was the first white church in the Atlanta area to racially integrate in the 60s and 70s. And the first church, women deacons, ordaining women, First Baptist Church Welcome affirming in Georgia. And so I had a very progressive church, and I stayed there 28 years. And I wrote, and I retired. I was basically, I had a pastoral co-pastor for my last 10 years, and she continued on as pastor. And we have a great relationship. Mainly what I do is she loves to call on me to do eulogies of the people before her time. I'm doing one next week, or gatherings. But I decided to do some part-time chaplaincy, hospice chaplaincy. And then in March, they offered me a full-time position. So at 72, I'm back working full-time and absolutely loving it, except when my alarm goes off in the morning. But, and it's, to me, I tell people, it's taking what I loved about ministry, that being there at liminal moments in people's lives, but without budgets or committee meetings or conflicts, just going to be with people. And it's incredible in Atlanta. across racial and gender. You're all kinds of people die, and I'm bit with them and their families when they do. So.
Thanks, Lenny. That's a great testimony to the power of relationships, really, is one of the sustaining through lines and one of the privileges of being a pastor and a chaplain, and other kinds of ministry too. But as a pastor, you really get to be part of people's lives, and it feels like a privilege.
It is.
Does someone else want to talk about what you're doing, or does the topic speak to you in any way? Do you have particular thoughts, questions, insights? I want to say one thing because I see Demetrius, his square in the thing. And if you are looking for one book to read about how to sustain yourself in long-term ministry, Demetrius has a great book called Sermons Will Ruin Your Life. And I found it to be personally, spiritually nourishing, and also it was a good reminder about why we do what we do. And I've shared it with several other pastors. So I just wanted to commend that as a book. Look for his book.
Thank you, Pastor Jim. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone.
Other thoughts about why about pastoring in the long term as a profession, or why you might return to it? Tell us what you're doing if you like. And
Well, I'm going to say, not only am I not pastoring, but I don't plan on pastoring, but I'm interested in hearing from all of you. So those of you that are, please continue to share your stories.
one of the things that PSR prepared me for is to do pastoring that isn't even just conventional pastoring. And I also have found that when in the periods of my life when I have been doing nonprofit work to bridge in between churches, which I always say, of course, at each of those junctures, I would say, I'm getting out of pastoring. I'm going to go do nonprofit work. And it wasn't that I was tired of pastoring. I was usually just tired of pastoring from the particular church that I've been working in. So I've worked in nonprofit, like in development, at the San Francisco Public Library. I used to be a librarian, and then also at something called the Oakland Peace Center in Oakland. But I found that the pastoring it's what I do, and it's also who I am. So even if I'm in a non-pastor role, conventionally, I'm still acting like a pastor. And that would happen when I worked at the San Francisco Public Library. We just opened a new branch in downtown San Francisco, the main branch, and it was very exciting and beautiful building. And they were unprepared for the large numbers of undomiciled people who came to be in the library because of its central location, its warmth, had computers. And whenever there was a challenge in the sort of human ecology of the place, I would hear my name called over the intercom. Jim Mitulski, please come to the blah blah. And usually it was not about my job in development. It was about what I knew about being a pastor that was valuable in that public or civic setting. And I wondered if others have had that too. It's not just what you do, it's who you are.
Went in here. So with the disclaimer that I'm not a senior pastor, but a minister, associate minister at a church, had been a youth pastor. When my day job at the San Francisco Foundation, me being outwardly a minister, or a former pastor, so to speak, it definitely shows up to work in that way. And whether that is in the informal kind of relationships with people, you can tell how folks are open to just talk and be more transparent with the emotional aspect, mental aspect of work, or really pastoral care is a real piece of supporting staff, sometimes even just as colleagues. And even in coaching, like there's an aspect of results-based coaching, and depending on the relationship, where I've had someone who's engaged me in that way, and like knowing that I'm a minister, or actually just said a few days ago, like, oh, I've got to come to your church. And as we were having a discussion about our career path, we were able to slide into the spiritual side as well. and how simple and seamless that is. So definitely being a pastor before you're a pastor is a thing, or even when you were formerly in a role and no longer, having never been in the senior role, but definitely a pastor in different forms. I definitely see that in my day-to-day work.
I went through a long period where I was working with children and youth, and then as a hospice chaplain, as well as children and youth, as an associate person. I was originally licensed and ordained in an evangelical tradition. And that wasn't recognized by the denominations I tried to find standing in. And so in the main line, and so I really had a hard time going from having a pastoral identity on the inside to not being recognized as having pastoral authority on the outside. It was the weirdest thing, like for years and years and years, until I finally, went through seminary. It wasn't until like right before I got my Doctor of Ministry that I was finally recognized by the Alliance of Baptists as like that entire time, they recognized that entire time as having been ordained, because they recognize my ordination. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, there we go. I planted a church for them in New Haven, Connecticut, and pastored it for 5.5 years until they became a viable congregation, which still exists today. And then I was called to be the senior minister of a 250-year-old church, where I'm pastor now, or senior minister now, with a youth minister who I treat like a colleague, not like I was treated, and that's really important to me. Having experienced feeling like a second-class citizen before I was recognized, I think having the call is step one, and that's when that pastoral identity that Jim was talking about starts to begin. And that's when that pastoral identity starts bubbling within. And as Demetrius was saying, kind of walking around, you're a pastor, whether you're an associate or a senior minister, you're a pastor, and you're even a pastor to the other pastors on staff. Or maybe a hospice chaplain, Lenny, being a chaplain to the other staff members on your circle of care team, not just the patients and their families. So it's really critical to, I think, find that identity within oneself, first and foremost. And, not everyone is called to be a pastor.
Right.
Some people are called to be strong lay people, and good for them. I hear that strongly in Mo. Like it sounds like Mo knows exactly who he is and who he isn't. And who he's called to manifest in the world, and like he can identify that for himself. I don't want to speak on his behalf, but he said he's not a pastor, so I believe the man.
Right. The hierarchicalizing of the professions is not helpful either way, or any way that it manifests. Like,
Correct.
like some people say, oh, being a pastor is, or the size of church that you serve as somehow should follow a certain linear trajectory. Small church when you're younger, and then each successive church should be larger, and that should be a marker of your success or something. I don't know. None of that is helpful. I mean, I really think that it's who we are, it's what we do, and it's that's what's the most important thing. And I also want to resonate with those. I came from another denomination. I'm in the United Church now, United Church of Christ, but I was ordained before I went to seminary. I was pastoring before I went to seminary. When I got to PSR, which was like the main line, right? I mean, people would even say things like, well, MCC was my church. It was like, well, that's not a real church, or there was this hierarchy of recognition, and it did affect my self-identity to some extent, except I derived my identity from my relationship with the people I was pastoring. I was like, no, the United Church of Christ, bless its heart, and I'm grateful for it, doesn't make me a minister. I was a minister before I ever went to Holy Hill. Lenny.
First of all, our Oakhurst Baptist Church was the first member to join the Alliance of Baptists. Walker Knight, Nancy Sehested, those were at Oakhurst. We were among the original group and the first one to vote to join the Alliance of Baptists. So we have that connection. But I was influenced so much. I mentioned Bob Brown. Bob Brown was a liberal among the liberals at PSR. It was an incredible man. He was probably at that point the most prominent white theologian, North American, in liberation theology. And Bob Brown would not wear any academic regalia. He went by Bob, not ever doctor. He did not give grades. You told him in class, he was so radical, and he affected me so much. And I was in a situation, First Baptist DC, very hierarchical, where an example would be that the Minister of Education, I went to a convention in Pittsburgh, and the senior pastor stayed at the Marriott downtown, and the two staff members commuted from Duquesne University. Took us an hour to get in and out while he stayed. When I came to be a pastor, the first thing I did was make sure everybody got the same continuing education funds. And then after 18 years of being kind of a senior pastor, an associate left, and I said to the church, and it was interesting how it was some people were right on board. I said, I'd like to create a model. There's no more hierarchy there's no more associate and pastor. And I proposed a pastoral team model, which we don't call co-pastors, because when we called Melanie Vaughn West at the time, Melanie and I had one job description, and we had an evaluation on one job description, and it was up to us about how we divided up, but every public presence was the same. We baptized the same number of babies, anything, we preached the same number of times. So our public ministry was of equality, and that was very much coming out of PSR, of wanting to create what Bob Brown, I imagine Bob Brown would do, a liberated church. So.
No, I was a co-pastor for several years too, and I know I learned to do that at PSR because it was counter to the, you could have associates.
Yep.
And I was not married to the person. That was
Me.
the only way you could be a co-pastor was husband and wife, and I'm gay anyway. But I had a lesbian co-pastor, and people just thought that was crazy. But I know I learned that value at PSR.